Good evening, everybody. My name is Steve Weitzman. I'm a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania and director of its Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. I want to welcome you to our program this evening, which is part of a larger series entitled Jews and the America to Come. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Katz Center is a research center whose goal is to deepen our understanding of Jewish history, culture, and ideas. And we see it as part of our mission to share the insights of scholars and intellectuals with the broader community. Much of the research that the Katz Center supports is focused on the Jewish past, but in this program tonight, we are grappling with the present moment, a time of profound social, cultural, and political transformation. Right now, here in Philadelphia and throughout the entire country, there is a struggle playing out over the future of America, and this series means to explore how Jews fit into that struggle. In the last presentation in this series that we hosted last week, our speaker then focused on the Me Too movement and its implications for the American Jewish community. In a few weeks from now, we will be hosting another scholar who will be addressing another transformative movement, Black Lives Matter. One of the things that these two movements share in common is a focus on power, on how it is used and abused. In both cases, the struggle for gender equality and the struggle for racial equality, there is a focus on how power is distributed in the United States and how it should be shared more broadly. Trying to figure out how Jews fit into this picture, what their role and responsibilities are in relation to these and other movements for equality and social justice is complicated. It's complicated by the fact that Jews themselves have a fraught relationship to power. Anti-Semites accuse Jews of having too much power, an ancient form of conspiracy thinking that is still poisoning American culture to this day. For their part, as descendants of people who faced extreme forms of persecution in the past, many Jews today identify with the powerless, with the oppressed and the left out, a sense of identity that moved many Jews to participate in the civil rights movement and other liberation movements. But that perspective can make it hard for Jews to recognize the ways in which they themselves might be part of the problem. Beyond such views is a more complicated situation where American Jews find themselves in a position between power and powerlessness, and tonight's program offers an opportunity to think about that in-between position. To lead us in this program, we have turned to someone who has been on the front lines of social transformation within the American Jewish community, an activist and leader who is helping to shape the future for Jews and for the world more broadly, Rabbi Jill Jacobs. Rabbi Jacobs is the executive director of TRUA, a human rights organization that calls on Jews to take action to create a more just world. We wanted to tap into her experience and vision as someone who has long worked to hold the powerful accountable. But we also turned to her because she is such a thoughtful scholar in her own right and an engaging teacher, producing books like There Shall Be No Needy, Pursuing Just Social Justice Through Jewish Law and Tradition, where she seeks to ground the fight for social justice and human rights in classical Jewish sources. As someone who's long admired Rabbi Jacobs for the work she does on behalf of a better future, I'm very grateful to her for sharing her perspective with us this evening. Before I turn things over to her, however, I just want to say a few words about how this program is going to proceed and also to add a few notes of appreciation. This program is going to run for about an hour. Rabbi Jacobs will be speaking for about the first half hour. And after that, we'll have time for questions and some discussion. You'll be able to submit questions by using the Q&A function that probably appears at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions either during the talk or after the talk. And then when Rabbi Jacobs is done with her remarks, we'll be joined on the screen by the Director of Public Programs for the Katz Center, Ann Albert, who will be moderating the Q&A and discussion part of this section of the program. We'll have a little bit more explanation after Jill Jacobs' remarks. So before I turn things over now, let me just say a few notes of thanks. First of all, I want to thank TRUA itself, which is a partner in this program. And I also want to thank the National Museum of American Jewish History for its partnership as well. And I want to thank the staff, the Katz Center staff, who are working behind the scenes to make this program possible. That includes Ann Albert, our Director of Public Programs, Diana Dennis Walters, who is our events coordinator, Brian Lipscomb, who is our technology support person, and Becky Friedman, who is our communications coordinator. I'm really grateful to them all. So with that, I'll turn things over to Rabbi Jacobs.
Thank you so much to Steve and to Anne and Diana and Brian for making today possible. It's really nice to be here. Thank you all for taking the time out to work through some texts and to talk about some difficult issues in what I know is a very busy week, probably for many of us, and perhaps an anxious week. I want to start by being clear about where I sit, which is as a practitioner. I know we're speaking at a university, I'm in my apartment, of course, but I'm speaking as a practitioner and as a rabbi, as you heard, the executive director of Trua, which organizes more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors across the United States to work on human rights issues, both here at home in the US and Canada, and also in Israel and the occupied territories, and not as an academic. So what I want to do today is I want to share some texts that I think are useful in terms of thinking about Jews in power. This is not a history lesson about how Jews have been perceived throughout history. I'm sure that the Cat Center can get a historian to do that, or a history lesson about Jews in politics. It'll be some texts, some classic texts and some modern texts that I think are useful for drawing out some of the tensions and anxieties and complexities when we talk about Jews in power. Now, when we say Jews in power, a lot of us might kind of get the heebie-jeebies that sounds like it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy, and indeed sometimes it is. When people talk about Jews in power, it kind of depends who they are and why they're talking about that. But I want to say that power is neutral. We all have power or don't have power, or have more power or less power in different parts of our lives in relation to different people, whether it's the power to make decisions for ourselves, whether it's the power we have or don't have as parents, as relatives, as employers, employees, et cetera, et cetera. We have different kinds of power. So power itself is something neutral. And it's something that, but there's of course different ways that power shows up. And as I'll talk about today, I think it's really important for us to talk about how power shows up in the ways that Jews show up in the world, which of course is in many, many kinds of ways, and the ways that we think of ourselves. Now, of course, we will be talking a little bit about anti-Semitism. This is not primarily about anti-Semitism, though of course we can't really talk about Jews in power without it coming up. So we'll get there here and there. So with that, what I want to do is, as I said, I want to work through some text. So I'm going to share my screen. I will warn you, I have texts that we could take hours and hours to go through these texts, but we won't. So we'll spend the time we have, and I'll encourage you to, you can always go back and take a look more deeply. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that now, yeah? Okay. Somebody will hopefully tell me if you can't. Okay, so I want to start not quite at the beginning, but in the book of Genesis at the very least. This is the famous story that, for those of you who are familiar with the Torah, you'll remember that Joseph gets sold into slavery in Egypt. He ends up in prison through a complicated story. You can go back and check it out. He ends up in prison. It turns out he's a fantastic dream interpreter. He interprets dreams there. Pharaoh is having some strange dreams, and somebody who was in prison with Joseph says, oh, there's this guy, you should get him to come interpret your dreams. Joseph comes, interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and tells him that there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, and what they have to do to prepare is they have to store food during the years of plenty so that they're ready for the famine. So that gets us to here. So I'm not going to read every word of this text. You can see it, hopefully, and I'll summarize. So the land, we're now in the time of famine. The people have run out of bread. And so the people cry out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh says to all of Egypt, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So this is a really important moment, because this is the moment in which Joseph is thrust into the classic Jewish middleman role. Now, Joseph doesn't know that this is a classic role, because it's not the classic role yet. He's the first person to be in it, but it becomes the classic role. The Jewish middleman, the court Jew, the Jew who ends up being the economic face of the king or the czar, who serves as a tax collector, because for different historical reasons, Jews often ended up in those kinds of positions. Now, again, this is no fault of Joseph. He doesn't know that this is going to be a theme throughout Jewish history, and I also don't blame the Jews who were forced into these kinds of roles. But what's important here is that the people in Egypt who are starving come to Pharaoh because, after all, Pharaoh is the one who's in charge. And Pharaoh's response is, go talk to Joseph. At which point, Pharaoh disappears from this story almost altogether. All the negotiations now are going to be between the people and Joseph. So the people are now not seeing Pharaoh face to face. They're seeing Joseph, who is the economic face of the kingdom. Okay, so Joseph sells the Egyptians the food that has been stored up for the last number of years, and they run out of money to buy the food, and they have run out of cattle. They've got nothing except for themselves and the land that they have. And then the people make this suggestion. So they say, why don't you buy us? We'll be slaves to Pharaoh. So they still know that Pharaoh's in charge. They know they're not going to be slaves to Joseph. So we'll be slaves to Pharaoh. And so Joseph buys all of the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. And all of the people, the individuals, and also the land all become Pharaoh's. So what we see here is that Joseph is the one who's doing the negotiation, but of course Joseph isn't the one who's directly benefiting. It's still Pharaoh benefiting, but Pharaoh's leaving Joseph, again, becomes this classic Jewish court Jew middleman kind of role. Pharaoh's letting Joseph do the dirty work of being the one who's actually buying the people into slavery, who's negotiating, who's dealing with the money, and Pharaoh can be off somewhere in the distance. The people don't see him, they don't have to deal with him, but of course he's ultimately the one who owns everything and who has all the power. Okay, so this deal goes through. The people say, you've saved our lives, etc., etc., and now forever and ever, that Pharaoh owns most of the land in Egypt, and so this system of servitude becomes permanent. Now Israel, because another piece of the story is that Joseph has managed to bring his whole family down to the land of Egypt. They are living in Goshen, a little bit off because they raise cattle, which is offensive to the Egyptians that they're raising cattle, and they're doing great. They're multiplying, they have nice land, everything is going great. Great story. Now, of course, we know what happens next, which is that Joseph dies and the whole generation dies, and his descendants are doing great. They're very, they're multiplying. And then this new king arises. We'll talk about that more in a second. And looks around and says, who are these foreigners? Why are they here? They're going to become a fifth column. What if they rise up or join with our enemies and go to war against us? We have to do something. And of course, what he does is he puts the people into slavery. Now, I want to point out that at this point, it seems like everybody has forgotten about Joseph. And it seems like there's no relationship between the Egyptians and the Jews, the Israelites, because we don't hear anybody at this moment. Now, of course, the biblical text is very terse. We don't have everything that happens. We don't hear anybody in this moment say, no, the Israelites are our neighbors. We stand with them, right? Israelite lives matter. We're going to stand up for them. We just don't hear that. Now, it's probably pretty anachronistic to expect that we would, but we don't hear any objection from the Egyptians, which is perhaps not surprising. Now, maybe they really don't remember Joseph. Maybe it was too long ago. Or maybe they remember that Joseph was the one that they negotiated with when they ended up themselves in servitude and turning over all of their land to Pharaoh. And maybe they are still blaming him and still see the Jews as the ones who have somehow benefited off of this situation. And we see that actually in this midrash. There's a tradition, the rabbis, both in the Talmud and midrash, notice that it never says that Pharaoh died and that there was another Pharaoh. It just said that a new Pharaoh or new king arose. And so there's a suggestion that it was actually the same Pharaoh. And so this one midrash says, no, same Pharaoh. But what happened is that the people all said, let's go out against the Israelites. And Pharaoh says, what are you talking about? They saved our lives. And they just, the people refuse. Now, again, we can imagine that the people, according to this midrash, see Joseph not as their savior, but the one who put them into servitude, even though they're in servitude to Pharaoh, but Joseph is the economic face of the kingdom. And so according to this midrash, the people kick out Pharaoh, they dethrone him, and he has to ultimately agree to this populist sentiment to do something about the Israelites to put them into slavery in order to get his position back, which of course he does because he's more interested in power than in any kinds of human rights protections, let's say. Okay, so we have this classic position of Jews as being in this in-between position, very often having to negotiate with power, having to make choices about whether we want to ally ourselves with those in power for our own protection, very often finding out that those royal alliances might last for a little while, a generation or two, but ultimately don't protect us, and making decisions about whether our alliances are with the king or the czar or whoever's in charge, or whether it's with the people, and how we negotiate that middle role that we're often thrust into. So here's another midrash, another way that it plays out. Midrash, there's different levels of knowledge about Jewish text. Midrash I would call rabbinic expansions on the biblical text. So anything from legal material to the rabbis reading between the lines and imagining what could happen, to, as this one that we're about to see, really just spinning off other things that don't necessarily even have anything to do with the biblical text. So this is a midrash on Shir HaShirim, on the Song of Songs. And the verse that they're going to play with, though again, the actual biblical text is not really relevant, is "Before I was aware, she set me in the most lavish of chariots." So here's where they go with that. Rabbi Chia taught, this may be compared to a king's daughter who is gathering stray sheaves. So the daughter is, for some reason, we don't know why, at the side of the road, gleaning sheaves. This is the poorest of the poor, the ones who go out into the fields to glean whatever's left over from the crop, as you'll remember from, for example, the book of Ruth, where Ruth is out in the field gleaning because she and her mother-in-law have no land of their own, are very, very poor. So the king's daughter, for some reason, is out there gleaning in the fields. Now, we need another midrash to explain why she's there. Did she run away from home? Is she just trying to see how the regular people lived? Did her father kick her out? Was she separated at birth? Is she the product of an illegitimate relationship that her father had? We really have no idea, but for some reason she's out there. The king passes by and recognized that she was his daughter. So he sends his friend to take her and to seat her with him in his carriage. Her friends looked at her in astonishment, saying, "Yesterday we were gathering sheaves, and today you sit in a carriage with the king." She said to them, "Just as you are astonished at me, so I am astonished at myself." And she applied to herself the verse, "Before I was aware, she set me in the most lavish of chariots," the verse that we start with. So again, we don't know what the actual situation is. Is she really surprised, or does she know all along that she's the king's daughter and she's just embarrassed to tell her new friends that? Or perhaps she's never met her father because she's the daughter of someone he had a little fling with, but somehow he knows what she looks like, or we don't know what the situation is, but she certainly says that she is astonished. Now, what happens, this is the other part we don't know, when she goes back to the palace with him? Does she become the advocate for the poor? Does she forget her friends? What does she do next? We have to write that story ourselves. But this is what's called in Midrash the mashal, which is the parable. And we'll look next at the nimshal, which is how you play out the parable, say what it's actually talking about. So what it's talking about are the Israelites. When the Israelites were in Egypt, they had to work with bricks and mortar, and they were repulsive and contemptible in the eyes of the Egyptians. When they became free and were delivered and placed as a viceroy, they were like second in command over all the inhabitants of the world. The nations were astonished and said, "Yesterday you were working with bricks and mortar, and today you have become free and are viceroys over the whole world." And Israel said to them, "Just as you are astonished at us, So we are astonished at ourselves, and then it quotes the verse that we've been playing with. So this, I think, is the perfect Jewish power fantasy in a few different ways. First of all, the Jews in this story, the Israelites here, are saying, you know what? We are just this lowly people. We're just slaves. 2 minutes ago, we were in Egypt being insulted and hated and spit on and all of that. And we actually have no idea how we got here. We forgot our relationship with God. We have no idea how we got into freedom. And we actually maybe feel a little bit more comfortable in that position of seeing ourselves as not having that much power, because if you are powerless, then you don't have a lot of responsibility. So maybe we're more comfortable there. But it's also a power fantasy, because you notice that we have the Israelites placed as second in command over the whole world. First in command, obviously, was God. So the Israelites are the number one human command over the whole world, which, I'm not a historian, but in my knowledge of Jewish history, that has never happened in Jewish history, except maybe in some anti-Semites conspiracy theory, but definitely not in real Jewish history. And so we see this tension between the writers of this midrash wanting on the one hand to say, yeah, we're powerful. Look at us. We have this relationship to God. We're sitting in the chariot with the king, and that's awesome. And we are in charge, and we're elevated above everyone else in the world, even though, of course, the writers of the midrash know that have never experienced that situation. They're living under other nations' commands. So wanting to hold that power, but also wanting to not claim it, because it is scary to have power. And sometimes it's more comfortable to say, no, we're just an oppressed people. So I want to look at, I know I'm moving through a lot of text really fast, and we'll have a chance for questions later. Normally we'd have a little more back and forth, but we're not all sitting in a classroom together, so we can't have a discussion as we go. So I want to look at one very famous line from the Passover Seder, and we'll do this in song, but not by me because I can't sing. Okay, so this is a famous line that says, I'll just translate it, that says that in every generation, we have to see ourselves as though we had come forth from Egypt, from Mitzrayim. And this idea that we're always telling that in the Seder, we say, this is because of what God did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. So this sense of projecting ourselves back into this powerlessness, and also power, the powerlessness of having been slaves, and also the power of coming forth out of slavery and experiencing that liberation. So there's one other version of this line. So the version that I just played is the version that perhaps most of us know. It's what's printed in most Haggadot, but there's also a version that's based on a text by Maimonides that is in many Sephardic Haggadot that I'll just go back and play now.
בכל דור ודור חייב אדם להראות את עצמו כאילו יצא ממצרים.
Okay, so this version has just one change of word, which is that in every generation we have to show ourselves as though we've come forth from Egypt, from Mitzrayim. So as opposed to see ourselves, to show ourselves. And so I want to suggest that in that difference between what it means to see ourselves and what it means to show ourselves is also one of the challenges of power, that seeing ourselves forces us into this place of imagining what it would have been like to be slaves, imagining it's really an inward looking situation. We're looking at ourselves as having been slaves, as having experienced liberation, but showing ourselves means that we're also acting in the world in such a way as to show that we understand that experience of oppression and liberation. So I'm just gonna, okay. Okay, sorry. So a lot of times when we talk about the power that Jews do and don't have in the world, we talk about one of the very common phrases that we talk about is intersectionality. Just trying to pause this before it starts. I'll just go back. Is intersectionality, which is a term that is, I would say, much debated and understood, misunderstood, everything like that in social movements. And so I want us to just hear a clip from the person who invented the term intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw. So I'll just let her explain what it means.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities.
Okay. So when she talks about intersectionality, let's see, try to get us to not have to look at this slide. Maybe we can't do that. Okay. So when she talks about intersectionality, what she's talking about is the fact that we can have overlapping privileges and oppressions. So just to take, to take me for example, I'm Jewish, so I'm subject to anti-Semitism. I'm also white, so I don't have to worry about being killed by a police officer, being pulled aside in a store on suspicion of stealing. I'm also a woman, which means that I'm subject to sexism. I'm also a cisgender straight woman, which means that I'm not subject to homophobia or transphobia, right? We can all do that for ourselves and overlap the different privileges and the different oppressions we have. And one of the insights of intersectionality that I'm not going to really go into, but one of the main insights is that there are some prejudices that have to do with the overlapping categories. So for example, there are stereotypes about Black women that aren't true about Black men or about white women, or there are stereotypes, and we know this, about Jewish women that aren't true about Jews or about non-Jewish women. So that there are these overlapping places where we find particular stereotypes. Now, this is not really a difficult thing for many of us to understand, because we understand how all of the different oppressions and privileges that we might experience sometimes overlap, that in certain situations, just to take my example for example, that if I am walking down the street and there's a police car, I'm in a privileged situation because I'm not scared. If I'm in a synagogue and a white supremacist decides to take that moment to carry out a terror attack, then I'm vulnerable. Right? And we can all come up with the situations in which we might feel more or less powerful and more or less vulnerable. It's very often when we talk about, when intersectionality comes up in heated conversations, sometimes there's an idea that it's about which oppression is more important, or how can, we can't talk about this oppression because the other one is in front. But actually, those who are talking about intersectionality and progressive movements are saying, you know what, we're not going to put some of the prejudices aside. We're not going to say we're dealing with race right now, so we feel free to be sexist or homophobic, right? We're going to try to create movements in which we are addressing all of the different isms and phobias. Now, of course, nobody's perfect. None of this ever works out perfectly. But the idea is that it's not a competition about who's more or less oppressed, but that we are in different places in different moments. And that's particularly true for Jews and particularly true for white Jews. So for white Jews, and I want to be clear that Jews acquired whiteness, Ashkenazi Jews acquired whiteness. It was not something that was understood when, certainly when German and then Eastern European immigrants first started coming to the United States. So Jews acquired whiteness, and yet we don't see ourselves very often, for those of us who are white, who look white, we often don't see ourselves as white because we have those memories. We know that we see ourselves as having come out of Egypt. We see ourselves as the people who are gleaning by the side of the road. So we don't see ourselves as the ones in power. And that I would suggest that it's important for Jews to be able to see the places where we do have power and we don't have power, to see the ways in which we always are playing that middle role, the role that Joseph was the first one who figured out for us as Jews. Because very often when we aren't aware of those dynamics, then we end up stepping all over everything. We don't even know how to talk about our own power, our own lack of power. So with that, I just want to show one very last text. This is a little kind of a fun one. So this is going to be a text of the one version of the Golem story, which is a familiar story to many of us. The story that the Jewish community in Prague was able to create a creature out of clay that was able to defend the Jewish community. Now, this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek story, so just you'll see that. Don't take it too seriously. So the ghetto, and I'll end on this, and then we'll move into questions. So when the ghetto of Prague was being attacked and they were about to rape the woman, roast the children, and slaughter the rest, when it seemed that the end had finally come, the great Rabbi Loeb put aside his Gemara, his Talmud, went into the street, stopped before a heap of clay in front of the teacher's house, and molded a clay image. He blew into the nose of the golem, and it began to stir. Then he whispered the name, meaning God's secret holy name, and our golem left the ghetto. The rabbi returned to the house of prayer, and the golem fell upon our enemies, threshing them as with flails. Men fell on all sides. Prague was filled with corpses. It lasted, so they say, through Wednesday and Thursday. Now it is already Friday. The clock strikes 12, and the golem is still busy at work. So the golem is, of course, the ultimate Jewish power fantasy. What if we could make a monster that would destroy all of our enemies who have been persecuting us for so many years? It's kind of the ultimate power fantasy of a persecuted people. But there's a problem because the golem is killing everybody. Now, again, this is tongue-in-cheek, so just don't take it too seriously. Rabbi cries ahead of the ghetto. The golem is slaughtering all of Prague. There will not be a Gentile left to light the Sabbath fires or take down the Sabbath lamps. So where's our Shabbos goy? Where's the person who's going to light our lamps for us? Okay. So that's the concern. But really, I think what that concern is saying is this has gotten out of control. We were having our power fantasy, but we actually don't want to have that much power. Let's shut that down. And so the rabbi goes out and calms down the golem. And I'll just skip to the last paragraph. To this day, the golem lies hidden in the attic of the Prague synagogue, covered with cobwebs that extend from wall to wall. No living creature may look at it, particularly women in pregnancy. No one may touch the cobwebs, for whoever touches them dies. Even the oldest people no longer remember the golem, though the wise man Tzvi, the grandson of the great Rabbi Loeb, ponders the problem: may such a golem be included in a minyan, a congregation of worshippers, or not? The golem, you see, has not been forgotten. It's still here, but the name by which it could be called to life in a day of need, the name has disappeared, and the cobwebs grow and grow, and no one may touch them. What are we to do? And this story is so rich, and we could spend a lot of time on it. But what I want to point out is that this golem, which again is the Jewish power fantasy that then has to be calmed down because we actually can't deal with having that much power, is now hidden away in the attic of the Prague synagogue. And I've actually heard from people, I was there as a kid and I don't remember this, but I've heard from people there more recently, there's actually a sign saying where the golem is rumored to be hidden, pointing to the attic. But once the golem is hidden and nobody knows how to operate it anymore because nobody's alive who knows how to say God's secret name, it actually grows more powerful. So this power is hidden away, but now it's not just in the golem when it's walking around, but even the cobwebs are too dangerous to touch. And these cobwebs are growing and growing. And I think this is a perfect metaphor for power, that we can't deal with power. And so we try to stick it in an attic and hide it. But actually when we hide it and don't talk about it and don't process it and don't deal with its complexities, it actually gains in strength and then operates in ways that are unhelpful and that we are not able to recognize and to name and to deal with. So I'm going to stop there and take questions.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Jacob. So I'm going to want to introduce the virtual stage, as it were, our Director of Public Programs, Ann Albert. And she's going to be collecting questions that hopefully audience members are going to feel comfortable submitting through the Q&A function. And while they're doing that, I thought I would ask a question of my own, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering if you could just reflect kind of so you've underscored this discomfort that American Jews have in kind of acknowledging power as a legitimate kind of moral state. But at the same time, the American Jewish community, is a privileged community. It does have a lot of collective power. It can influence the course of events. And I'm wondering if just for a minute or two, you would assess how we're doing with the exercise of power. How are we using it properly? How are we misusing it as a community?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Jewish community is in this place where we do have a lot of power as a community. We have a lot of institutions that we've built over the years, because of course that's what we had to do as as a minority community. You have to build institutions. We've built a lot of institutions. Jews have always been really good at building institutions wherever we are to take care of ourselves. So we have a lot of powerful institutions. And no door in America is closed to us. There obviously was a time when that was not true, but now we can get into any college or work in any job, live wherever we want. So we do have some degree of power. And, and of course, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about communal institutions because individual Jews are in individual situations. So first of all, of course, not all Jews are white. I just want to be really clear about that. So many Jews are also experiencing racism. Many Jews are not born in this country, experiencing xenophobia, right? So all of the phobias, like all of that can also apply to Jews. As a community, we do have power though. And sometimes, perhaps not as much as the anti-Semites say. And I think one of the dynamics is that sometimes when Jews get anxious, we tend to, we have a lot of action. We tend to do a lot of things and sometimes want to draw attention to ourselves in certain ways. And so sometimes that ends up having a counter effect. Now, this is, again, part of what it means to be a community that's in between, that we're worried about anti-Semitism, and so therefore we kind of want to claim power, but we're also scared of claiming power. A lot of this, I'm sure that there's going to be questions around Israel. A lot of this for sure comes up around Israel and Palestine and the ways in which we're scared about anti-Zionism, about criticism of Israel that maybe sits uncomfortably for some of us, depending on where we are. And so some of the response is to try to shut it down, to try to ban certain kinds of speech on Israel, or to try to ban certain groups that are pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel. And I would suggest that sometimes that doesn't necessarily go so well for any of us, for free speech, for Jews, for non-Jews, because what it ends up looking like is here comes the Jewish institutions with all of their collective power coming down on, let's say, progressive institutions. So that's maybe one of the places where we're maybe not so great at using power. But I also think that in terms of places where we are great at using power, we have a lot of organizations that are standing up for justice in different ways. I mean, we've seen this certainly over the last few years, the level of activity, of political activity among Jewish organizations standing up for the rights of immigrants and refugees and standing up against racism, et cetera, and realizing that for those of us who are situated to have some power, that one of the ways that we can use it is by standing with our neighbors and with other Americans.
Thank you so much for that. We have a number of really fantastic and thoughtful questions coming in, so I'm just going to do my best to do them justice here. Up first, we have one from Davida who points out that many, especially scholarly activists, base their sense of intersectionality in anti-colonialism. Mm-hmm. And anti-colonialism is itself grounded in Edward Said's sense of Orientalism, which seems to exempt non-Western oppressive regimes, including the Hellenistic, the Roman, the Ottoman empires. She points out that this seems like an important source of left-wing anti-Zionism that shades into anti-Semitism, and wonders if you could comment on that.
Yeah, okay, so you asked a lot of questions, or there's a lot in that question. Say, of course, the area that is now Israel and the occupied territories was, of course, a British colony, as we know. So I would say that the British were the colonial. I mean, they were the ones who colonized a big chunk of the world, not just that area. I don't know if this is exactly what's being asked, but maybe I'll just say in terms of the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which is very much a gray line. First of all, I have an article about this from a couple of years ago in the Washington Post that you can Google. It's called something like, "When is Criticism of Israel Anti-Semitic?" So I would say, so it's a gray line, but I would say that for people who say that Israel never should have been created, for example. Now, it's not a position that I hold, certainly. I believe very much that I'm very grateful for the land that the state of Israel is there. I'm raising kids with dual citizenship. But saying that, I don't think is ultimately is anti-Semitic any more than saying, for example, if we're talking about American history and we say, well, actually, maybe the Europeans never should have come here because America was founded on a genocide. Now, that is true. America was founded on a genocide, and that's the original sin of this country. And so I think that's a question that you can ask in history class. We can very easily imagine, or perhaps specific experience, having a history class where we talk about whether actually the Europeans never should have come to the United States, and whether what's now the United States, and whether maybe that would have been better because Native Americans are still fighting for their rights. And so I think it's a legitimate question. I mean, again, it's not where I stand, but I don't think it's automatically anti-Semitic to debate what happened in 1947 or earlier, and whether it should have happened and how it happened, or to suggest that there should be one democratic state, for example. It's not a position that I hold. I believe that two states is the most likely, and the most likely to produce human rights for both people. But it is a position that one can hold. But it becomes anti-Semitism when you start using classic anti-Semitic tropes, when you start to use conspiracies that Zionists are controlling the world, the same kinds of conspiracies that have been used against Jews. So there's places where it slides into anti-Semitism, but it's not automatically anti-Semitism. And also boycotting Israel is not automatically anti-Semitic. Israel is a country like any country. I mean, we're all boycotting North Korea and Syria, for example. And again, I'm not boycotting Israel, but one can choose to boycott a country without being anti-Semitic or racist or anything else.
Okay, fantastic. So we are just jumping into the heart of a lot of really difficult issues, and I'm going to throw another one at you.
Go ahead.
So Becky asks, when describing the Jewish story in the US, you said that Jews acquired whiteness. Can you explain how that was achieved, what you meant by that, and in addition, how the word acquired might participate in economic associations of historical Jewishness?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of books about this. They're both called something like, one is How the Jews Became White, and then there's a newer one that I can't remember the title, but you can find it. So there's a lot of history, but the different immigrant communities that came from Europe, so Jews and Irish and Italians, were not originally considered white. And there's a great line, and if you've read Tree Grows in Brooklyn, there's a line where some of the kids are beating up some Jewish kids, and one of the I think Irish or Italian, one of the non-Jewish kids says, "Oh, don't beat him up because my dad says that his father is a white Jew," and somebody else says, "Well, there's no such thing as a white Jew." So Jews certainly were not considered white when we first came here, and a lot of the stereotypes that we're now hearing about, let's say, Mexican immigrants or immigrants from Central America, were applied to us in terms of they're rapists, they're bringing disease, they're changing our culture, et cetera, et cetera. But it happens through again, I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to walk us through, but through that process of becoming, the next generation goes to public schools and speaks English and assimilates into the middle class, and et cetera, and eventually, and maybe there's other immigrant communities which are maybe even less white looking, and so eventually we get that perception of whiteness. Now that said, it's not complete. So when we talk about white supremacists, white nationalists, they have, they use a lot of the language that, let's say, German anti-Semites were using at the end of the 19th century, the fear of Jews basically hiding out as white. So there's a whole white supremacist trend of noticing Jews, like outing Jews as Jews, like, oh, they're hiding as white people, but really they're Jews. And so, so it's not complete. And yet for those of us who are white Jews, if I walk down the street, nobody knows that I'm Jewish if I'm not wearing anything obviously Jewish.
Okay, thank you. That was an amazing on one foot version of a complex issue. I think I want to turn next to a question from Bridget, which is of a different sort of taking a different approach to the kinds of things that you talked about. She says, how would you connect the teaching you offered about intersectionality with the ways this term is often misused? When people with less power than us use this term differently, how might we respond constructively but not defensively?
Sure. It's hard to talk without a particular example. I will say that a lot of the discussion about intersectionality that I hear is in the world of people being upset about this term and often not understanding it, which is why I wanted to bring Kimberly Crenshaw. I feel like she can speak for herself about what it actually means. But I think that, I think perhaps one of the questions that's really being asked is, how do we deal with anti-Semitism when it crops up in progressive movements, or maybe with people who are not as used to, who don't know that many Jews. And for me, it's always about relationships. I have a million conversations with partners that we work with at Trua, with just people in the field, where things come up. Like somebody might say, something that comes up all the time is, oh, Jews are good with money, right? And I might say, actually, that's an anti-Semitic stereotype. And usually that person says, oh, I didn't know that. I thought it was a compliment. And okay, so there's plenty of times in my life that I've learned that a particular word actually has a racist history, or that, I've unlearned all sorts of different things in the course of my life. I think that hopefully we all have. And if you're in relationship, then you can have those conversations. Now, where it's unhelpful is when you're not in relationship and people are just writing opposing op-eds at each other and screaming at each other without ever sitting down and saying, when you said that, this is how it landed. And so the work always really has to be in those conversations that don't end up on the op-ed pages, but are just in relationship.
Great. Okay, so I think the next question from Barbara and Richard Hirsch sort of follows up on that in your work at Trua. They ask you to please explain how Trua navigates alliances or opt out from them with partners when intersectionality is and is not determinative. So in different words, thinking about issues with the Women's March, with Black Lives Matter events, not the organization. What are the principles that you use that can be used? How do you make decisions about participation or non-participation?
Sure. Well, first of all, we assume that in coalitions, we're never going to agree with everybody about everything. Because if you had to agree with everybody about everything, you would never be in a coalition. And so one example is that we've worked with the US Conference of Bishops on solitary confinement. Now, we really disagree with the US Conference of Bishops on a lot of issues having to do with reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights. And it's not like we didn't talk about that. I mean, we laid that out, and we're really clear that we put it on the table that that was something that we all disagreed on and would never work on together, but we really agreed on solitary confinement, and so we could work on that together. And I think that that's really important to say. We should all be able to agree that Black Lives Matter. I mean, that shouldn't even be up for discussion. I mean, that's in the first chapter of the Torah, that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. So if we're going to work on race in America, let's work on race. We don't also have to agree on every other issue, or really on Israel is the issue that comes up. Or if we're going to work on immigration, let's work on that. And we can argue about things elsewhere. But if we can't come together to work on what we agree on, then we're never going to get anything done.
All right, so there are a few questions that are centering in on the question of power and the use of power by Jews. So I want to just combine two of them together into one question, and you can respond however you choose. So one of them is from Deborah. Deborah points out, it's more of a comment actually, in relation to some of the earlier discussion, that Jewish power in America is insecure power. When Trump was elected, there was a lot of discussion and anxiety about leveraging access while standing for moral correctness. So that's one part of that question. And then the other one is from someone who's going unnamed. Anonymous says, on the continuum of powerlessness, for example, the Holocaust and overt violence connecting with racist Kahana ideology, where do we find a path for using power, as in Israel, for offensive self-defense? Like, for example, in Israel's preemptive airstrikes. And is there some kind of application to justify a first strike? So without necessarily addressing the specific political question about what the right strategic moves are, how do you think about the use of power in these in geopolitical terms?
Yeah, okay, so the first question, so in terms of the question of access or morality, just to go back to Pharaoh, Joseph thought that he could ally himself with Pharaoh and it would work out, and it did work out for a while. It was great for his family. I mean, it saved the life of his family that they were able to move to Goshen, and then they ended up in slavery, and that's a bargain that Jewish communities have had to decide whether to make or not. Do you ally yourself with the king or the czar who might protect you for the moment, but probably not in the long run? And it might make you more susceptible to everybody else hating you. And I think in the case, and it's true that Jews in the US Jews always have been insecure. So I think even as secure as we've been for so many generations, many of us in the United States, there's always that worry. I know that, I'll say that both of my kids had passports before they were a month old. And I think that's not a uncommon Jewish experience, that you always have your passports ready, even if you think that you're safe. So with that said, I think with Trump in particular, it was very clear from the beginning that an alliance with him was not going to protect the Jews, because we saw that he was interested and open to riling up his white supremacist and white nationalist base, and certainly we've seen that with, and we just celebrated this week, or not celebrated, we just commemorated this week rather, the second anniversary of the murders in Pittsburgh, and we've had lots of white nationalist violence, not only against Jews but against immigrants and others. And so we saw that, and we've seen that even the moves that are supposed to be about the Jewish community, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for example, he, which was not, don't agree with that as a smart political move that is actually helpful for anybody in the long run. But one of the speakers at the embassy move, as well as at the Hanukkah party the following year, was a pastor who has said very clearly the Jews are going to hell. So like, you can see who your actual friends are. And I think in that case, it's important to stand up for morality. My own organization, Tro, we've been around since 2002. I haven't been there the whole time, but we had relationships in the Bush administration and met with and have met with both Republicans and Democrats, and certainly had relationships in the Obama administration. We have no relationships in the Trump administration because it's clear that they're not interested in having those across the board relationships. And it's also clear that they're not concerned about issues of human rights. In terms of the specific military question, I'm not going to answer a military question. I will say that I run a human rights organization, so any kinds of moves like that also have to be made in the context of international human rights laws.
Thank you. So we're getting close to the end. There are two questions that have come in that ask you to sort of put the rabbinic hat back on and get back into the texts that you shared with us at the beginning. So I'm going to share those with you and kind of let you end with that hat. So one of them is Virginia saying that she's very interested in what happens when the king's daughter gets in that carriage. So as you pointed out, we don't know if she had some experience of privilege beforehand or was coming into royalty for the first time, but we do know that she now has two sets of experiences. So how do you see that in terms of intersectionality? Does one experience or set of experiences supersede the other and move someone into a different power category, et cetera? So you can think about that. Maybe I'll let you answer that one and then I'll ask them.
Okay, so we don't know. That's the whole text. I gave you the whole text. So you have to write your own midrash on it. But I will say that the options are all open for her. Is she going to completely forget her friends who are gleaning, or is she going to become their champion in the palace? We don't know. So feel free to write her story.
Fantastic. Okay, and the last one was again from Davida, who asks if you could please address texts about not oppressing a stranger. So Exodus 23:9. She says when she once studied Talmud with an Orthodox rabbi, he said that strangers were not non-Jews, but just Jews we don't know. And that the laws about pikuach nefesh, saving lives, exempt Jews from helping strangers who might turn out to be dangerous. And this was bothersome to her, and she wondered if you can talk about them a little bit.
Okay, so the ger has, which is the word that gets translated as stranger, or sojourner, refugee. There's probably a few more translations that I'm forgetting. So that term in the Bible means somebody who has come from somewhere else and is now living among the Jewish people, presumably for the long run. And because there's no conversion in the Bible, that's important to say. So the Bible doesn't have a concept of conversion. So you can, there's marriage, right? So, but so the ger, they might marry a Jew, but they're in that Jewish community as a non-Jew without any way into the Jewish community. And so there are certain laws that apply to them, mostly the do nots, the negative laws, and certain laws that don't apply to them, mostly the ones that you have to do. So that's their situation. And in the Bible, they're permanently landless. So they're in a complicated situation. They can't own land, and that's why they're always going to be at the margins. And that's why there's commands about taking care of them and not oppressing them because they're vulnerable. And ger is also, it's not a fixed term. So meaning that when the Israelites are in Egypt, then we're gerim, we're strangers or sojourners. But then when we're in our own land, now we are citizens and other people are gerim. And also we have, for example, we have God describing all of the people as gerim, even in the land of Israel, compared to God, who is permanent, that we're just there temporarily. And we have in Psalms, the psalmist saying that I'm just a ger, like I'm just here on earth for some small amount of time. I don't even know how long. None of us know. And so the ger, so it means that you're in some kind of a in between kind of situation, which is why there's vulnerability there. So in the Talmud, now there's conversion. Now conversion is something that is possible. And so the term changes meanings. So for the rabbis in the Talmud, it does mean somebody who is converted into Judaism. And so it just gets a whole new set of meanings layered over the biblical set of meanings. But just looking at the biblical text, certainly I think of it as the obligation to take care of somebody, to watch out for the rights of refugees, which I think is probably the most likely translation, because why would somebody leave where they lived to go to someplace where where they don't know anybody and they're an outsider? It's got to be because you have to leave. And in terms of pikuach nefesh, also, I'm just not going to go into all of the details of the law, but I would say that there's certainly a strong emphasis toward pikuach nefesh, as well as toward, there's long debates in Judaism about how much danger you have to put yourself in to save somebody else's life. So you don't have to necessarily sacrifice your own life, but maybe if it's a little danger, but they're definitely in a lot of danger, right? There's all kinds of different permutations. But I would say that you don't stop to interview the person about their their religious background and their intentions and their feelings about Jews or anything else before you save a life. You step in and you save a life.
Thank you so much. There are many more questions that we're not going to get to, but I think this is a good time to wrap it up and let Steve have the last word here.
Yes, I want to conclude by thanking you, Rabbi Jacobs, for insights that I think provide a kind of framework for understanding every other talk in this series, which all involve intersections of power and powerlessness in one way or the other. And beyond that, I just want to thank you for the very, very important work that you're doing, and for having such a belief in the future. It's really inspiring at this moment. I want to thank the audience for your great questions, and I want to invite you to the next talk in the series, which is on November 9th at 7:30 p.m., which is about the future of American support for Israel. And next week is a very consequential political week, so I wish us all the best for that too. So thank you all and have a good evening.